All right, welcome back, everyone. Yesterday we went over the process of deploying a full stack application. So here we can see that my API is actually working. If I send a request over HTTPS, it's able to successfully process that request, and I'm getting this test was successful, or we are connected. Inside of my application itself, we can see I am still within Hypertext Transfer Protocol safe, and I can log in a user. Take a look at my list, do the whole CRUD application here, and be able to log out. Right. So that's our current state of our application. Now, when it comes to logging in, the way we're handling our user token is we're currently storing it within our local storage inside of our site's application. This isn't necessarily good practice, especially when it comes to deployment. If you're doing it during development, perfectly fine. But during deployment, you're exposing your user's credentials essentially, right? Now that we have a token assigned to a user, essentially a user no longer needs to provide their username and password to be authenticated. So this token would be the same thing as them as us acquiring their username and password. So we have to figure out a way to secure this, store its value in a different location so that it's not exposed to any sort of cross-scripting attacks, right? Well, let's take a look at something else that has authentication. For example, GitHub, right? If I come over to GitHub and I inspect my application, go over to local storage, they have a couple of references, which seems to be an object of arrays with a couple of different key value pairs. All right. But if we take a look at this thing called cookies, inside of cookies, this is where they're storing my actual user session, right? I'm sure this is where they store some of my credentials as well. But here you can see that they are demonstrating me as logged in. Here's my actual username. They even store my time zone in there, yeah, as a cookie. And here's my user session. So every time I make some sort of change inside of my application, this user session gets sent along with my request. And that's how the server is able to authenticate that I, the user, am doing an action inside of GitHub. We want to essentially mimic that behavior, right? If we try to take a look at their JavaScript file, currently here inside of our JavaScript, if I take a look at our sources, go over to utilities, well, whenever a user signs in, we are applying this authorization header into the token, or excuse me, into the framework that we're utilizing to send request, all right? And we do the same thing within Thunder Client. So we're essentially turning Thunder Client to some JavaScript code. This is great, and it does work. We've seen it work, but it's not necessarily how server-side authentication is supposed to work, right? This header here inside of my API headers should no longer be necessarily added into my code, as well as the way this token gets formatted or the way my server pulls the token. It shouldn't be looking for it within the request headers. It should be looking for it, or excuse me, within the request headers. That's right. It should be looking for it within the request itself. So how do we change that? All right. Let's go ahead and take a look at our backend framework. And let's talk about how our token authentication actually works. I'm going to go into the user app, come over to the views, which is where we have this token authentication. Looks like I'm getting a little bit of weird behavior from the command palette. So let me go ahead and select a Python interpreter here. Oh, I don't even know which ones I have. All right, there you go. So now I'm able to recognize all of my dependencies within VS Code. But so the main reason why I made sure that that is the correct Python interpreter that VS Code is using is because I want to take a look at this token authentication class that we're utilizing as our authentication class for all of our API views. Well, I'm going to go ahead and hold down Command and click on that. It's going to open up the class itself inside of REST Framework. All right. So inside of REST Framework, we have the token authentication class, which is inheriting from base authentication. And we have here something called keyword and a model named none. Well, let's take a look at how this method gets called. And so the first thing it does is it tries to authenticate credentials, I believe. Let me take a look here. Let's just go from top to bottom, and then from there we can decipher it, right? So we have this get model method, which is saying, hey, if the model was none, I want you to return self.model. And this is asking for self. So at some point, this model attribute is going to mutate, but it's saying if it is none, I just want you to return none. Otherwise, I want you to return the token class. All right. In this authenticate method, we have auth for get authorization header dot split. So let's take a look at that get authorization header. Get authorization header is a function that takes in a request. It looks for authorization being as the header inside of the request and some binary string, all right? It then encodes that binary string and returns it. All right. That's basic authentication. Trying to get back to token authentic. All right, awesome. Now we're going to split this string where essentially we're going to have token. We're going to have a list where one will be token and the other will be the actual value of token. Or this would be token key, right? Now, here we have some sort of validation and saying, hey, if there is no authentication, if this is an empty list, or token is lower, then we want to return none. All right. And if we take a look at the API convention, we know that this first word of token should be capitalized. Right? If I go back here, go into headers, I don't have a token here, but we can see it in utilities.jsx. All right, there we see the capitalization of the word token. All right. So if it is capitalized, it's going to ask, well, what if there's only one word or the length of this list is only one? Well, one of these credentials is missing. So it returns invalid, no credentials provided. If it's greater than 2, then we have too many credentials trying to pass. So this is also an invalid token header. So once it checks making sure that the header is formatted correctly, finally it grabs the token. It has this Unicode exception. It raises an exception if this doesn't match. But if this token does work and it's able to decode it, then finally it returns this authenticate credentials. So now authenticate credentials utilizes self to get a model. This get model method, we talked about it. It's either going to return the token itself or nothing. Now, if it returns the token, we then grab from objects. This is the equivalent of saying token dot objects dot get. And here what we're trying to get, or excuse me, dot user dot get. And here what we're trying to get is where the key is equal to key, right? And the select related, well, we have the related name. That's all the select related is actually doing, right? It's referencing the related name instead. And then it just matches our keys within the database. It does a one-to-one match and returns the actual token. Now, if that fails, we get an error saying, hey, this token is invalid. It's not within our database. If the user is not active, we get, hey, this user is inactive or deleted. But otherwise, we get back both the user and the token. And that's how our authentication works, right? We're essentially just doing a 1-for-1 match with the token itself. Does anyone have any questions regarding token authentication and how that actually works in the background? Let's hear it, Gary.
Can you change like the method of encryption? Is that possible?
Yeah, we definitely can. I could write some code here and completely mutate this file if I wanted to, which is kind of what we're going to be going into. Instead of mutating this file altogether, what we're going to do is we're going to inherit this token authentication class and utilize polymorphism to change the methods to meet our needs, There you go. Does that answer your question, Gary?
Uh, well, does it like when it authenticates, like when it does its like hashing, like can you change how it hashes?
You can, yes.
Okay. Uh,
Did you ask how?
yeah, well, yeah, we don't have to go into that. I know it's probably out of scope, but I was just curious.
Yes, you could definitely implement it. Definitely is going to be outside of the scope of this lecture, but I can send you a couple of resources later on. All right. Doesn't seem like there are any questions over how our token authentication works. So let's start with changing some of our parameters inside of our server here. And excuse me, I call it parameters, but they should be configurations, all right? So everything within your to-do project settings.py is considered a configuration. All of this inside of settings.py is going to get turned into a key value pair, essentially a massive dictionary that Django is going to utilize to reference to whenever a part of the program requires one of these configurations, right? So we, for example, debug equals false. That will get reference to when it comes to, hey, an exception is being raised. Do we return a template or not? All right, we'll have an if Django.settings.debug return a template, else return none. All right. So that's how something like that would get handled in the background here. Well, there's a couple of things that we have to add to our Django application in order to get it ready to accept HTTP cookies. So one, we have our allowed host for all. We have our course allowed origins, which is which we have set to true. And now we have to go into credentials, right? I want to say course allow credentials, meaning I am going to allow for cookies to be sent over HTTPS request. From there, I'm going to ask, hey, is my session cookie? Because now we're actually doing cookies. So why would we do cookies now where if we could have done it from the start, right? Well, cookies are only set when you're within an HTTPS environment, meaning that you have an actual encryption cert. That's the only way that you can actually set cookies. Otherwise, you're going to get some weird behavior where all of your code will be completely fine. You'll send the request, but the browser itself will block the communication saying, hey, that you're trying to set a header, but you're not in a secured state, so we can't accept this. All right. So it's not necessarily an error that you're running into, and it's not going to raise an error. Google Chrome or other browsers will just stop that functionality from happening. And then finally, we have to specify, hey, I want my session cookie to be analyzed only through HTTP. All right. Now, why HTTP instead of HTTPS? Again, the S is in reference to the browser not blocking us. This HTTP only is in reference to Django. This is allowing Django to recognize that now our cookies are not going to be part of the request.headers, but they're going to be part of the request itself, which we'll see here shortly once we actually go into writing some code. So those are the three new configurations that we need to add into our Django application. Does anyone have any questions over any of the three? All right. If there aren't any questions, next thing we're going to go into is changing our view for our logging in method so that when we send back our response is actually going to set the cookie into our server. I'm going to take that note off there, and we're going to pick it up here. All right. I want to return, or excuse me, I want to have a variable named response. And this is going to return a response that still looks pretty similar, but will no longer include the token. Right, it's just going to return my username. Okay, so it returns my username. What about the cookie? How do I want that cookie to be set within my response? Well, if we hover over response, we'll see that it has a couple of different functionalities. Let me see if we can find this set cookie method within the response itself. We can't. All right. So responses have a functionality called set cookie. I can grab the response itself, and I can call the function of set cookie. This is going to store a cookie within the browser, not within the JavaScript code. Now, what is it that I want this cookie to be? It takes in a couple of attributes. All right, if we hover over it, it looks like it wants key. It doesn't want, or excuse me, it needs the key and the value. And then it has a couple of optional parameters. All right, a lot of them could be left empty. But let's go into providing the parameters that it needs here. So one, it needs a key. The key that I want to utilize here is token. And it needs a value. Again, we're going to pass token key. Should look pretty similar up to this point. But now it comes into some of the web development unique stuff. We have our HTTP only attribute, which we set to true inside of configurations. Then we have our secure attribute. We're within HTTPS, so this is going to be true. Now we're going to utilize same site. Well, same site, this means that I would have to be doing something like server-side rendering in order for this to happen, or to have some sort of strict mode, right? But the entire reason why I implemented CORS, which stands for cross-origin resource sharing, is because I'm working within two separate servers. So they're not within the same environment. So the same site attribute is going to be lax, which essentially stands for relax, let it happen. It's like just accept the request, right? And then we finally have an expire attribute. Well, now this expires. What would that look like? if I go into expires as expecting a string that falls within date time. All right. Well, let's create our lifetime for our token. Can name this lifetime. And we're actually gonna grab date time here. And I'm gonna grab this time delta function as well. All right, so lifetime. We're going to utilize datetime.now to grab today's date. And then I'm going to add a specific number of days to today's date. Let's say I want the token to be good for a whole week. Well, then in that case, I would specify, hey, time delta would be 7 days. And that gives me my lifetime. I'm going to take the time of now. This is going to reference to the return of this time of now, and it's going to add 7 days. Now, I wish this could be as simple as just utilizing this lifetime in here, but unfortunately, we have to format this into a string f time. So now let's go ahead and run a format lifetime. And here we're going to reference lifetime itself for its return value and call a string format method. Now the string format method is going to ask for some pretty conventional or standard things. It will just wants to know, hey, what is the format that you want my information back in? This A, I believe, stands for year, but I may be wrong. Give me a second to type this out, and then we could go back. So we have A. I know the D stands for day. Then we have this B, which I'm also not 100% sure what it stands for. Y is for year. H is for hour. Then we have minute, seconds, and then GMT is the standard time zone that my Django application is utilizing. I'll have to get back to everybody as far as what this ADB stands for, but this last piece of the string stands for year, hour, minute, and seconds. Finally, I can say, well, I want this to expire in my formatted lifetime. Now I created the response up here. Instead of returning a new instance of response, I can return the response I have already created. That's how my user is going to log in now. Again, I created the response. It's just an instance of the class. I removed the key from the response. I then created a lifetime and formatted said lifetime so that it's an acceptable format for HTTPS and for browsers to be able to accept it and interpret it. And then I utilized the set cookie function to set a key value pair where the key will be token, the value will be the token key. I am sending it over HTTP only, secure because we're within HTTPS. It is not from the same site. It is happening over CORS, so this needs to be lax. And I specified the expire attribute to be the same as the formatted lifetime that we created. And then finally, I returned the response. Does anyone have any questions over how we're going to be setting this cookie over the web? Let's hear it, Brandon.
I don't have a question, but I was just gonna say that the A means abbreviated weekday, the D means the day of the month, and the B means the month name.
Nice. Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so A is abbreviated week, day of the month and then month name?
Correct.
Oh, nice. Thanks. Did you just look that up or you knew that off the top of your head?
No, I just looked that up. I'm not like that.
All right. So now that we have this inside of our VS Code, let's implement it within our actual EC2 instance or deployed site. All right, currently here I can run, oh, actually, I need to push this. All right, so I can run get status. There you can see the changes that I have are happening within my views and my settings.py. No other changes have been applied. I run get add, you get commit, login creates HTTP cookie, and get push. It's ready to deploy, not ready to deb. All right. So there you go. I pushed all of my recent changes here. Now within my EC2 instance, I can just pull them. So get pull, origin, ready to get deployed. And you'll see that my changes were applied, right? My settings has 6 new lines, which is what I expected. And my API is now been refreshed. Well, let's take a look at what happens. Gonna go ahead and go into my to-do project or my backend. I am going to pkill G unicorn. And then from there, I'm going to restart G unicorn. Right, so I'm gonna say G unicorn to do project.wsgi -- bind. I want to bind this to 0, 0, 0 at port 8000. I'm not going to run it in daemon mode just yet. I want to test that it is still working. I send the request. It is still working. Let's take a look at what happens during login. Me log out, my JavaScript code still works. Logout process still working the same. I'm going to go to login here. And let's see what happens when I click on submit. All right, so my token gets placed as undefined. I never changed my JavaScript code. So this makes sense, right? It was able to store something. The code of local storage.set item still exists, but it's getting undefined. That's because that key of token is no longer within my response. Well, what's happening within cookies? Well, now inside of my cookie, I have a token with the correct token being placed in there. It's falling within Tango dep, HTTP only, secure, and it's following the same site lax rules that I passed it. And you can even see the day that it expires, which is what we set it to, 7 days from now. Let's see, day expires or max age. Is that 7 days from now? It is 7 days from now. Nice. So there's our token being set as an HTTP cookie. Does anyone have any questions over how we applied these changes to our EC2 instance? All right. If no one has any questions, let's go ahead and make the remainder of our changes. And we're going to be concentrating a lot of code. Unfortunately, if we were to demonstrate each one of these at a capabilities at a time, we would have to go over sign out and then sign up and repeat the process over and over again. Let's try to update all of our views at once. And then from there, we'll move into processing our functionality for entire application. Right, so currently my login works, and we saw that it works correctly. Well, I can copy all of this information here from line 45 down to line 56. And you can see that that's almost the same exact response that we're returning down right up above, right? For our post method for sign up. So I'm actually going to change said post method. I'm adding the same thing here. I am changing this to new user to make sure it matches. This should be a 201 created because I created a new user. All right. Everything as far as the formatting of the cookie and setting the cookie works exactly the same. So there's my sign up form. I now have my login form. We're going to leave token required alone for a second there. Let's talk about how we're going to remove this token. Well, in order to remove this token, my response, because remember, we no longer have an HTTP method, or excuse me, we no longer have a header within the request. I can't just delete from the api.common.defaults.headers inside of utilities.jsx the value of token. I need to delete it from the browser itself. Well, I'm going to do that by telling the browser to delete a cookie. And this just takes in the key of the cookie, which we named token. Now we can return our response. So there's our logout. We're able to log in and sign up. Again, I'm gonna create or push these changes. Everything got pushed into GitHub. I can go back to my EC2 instance here. I can git pull. It's going to update everything. Again, I'm gonna kill G unicorn. Actually, I don't need to because I never ran it in daemon mode. So I'm just gonna bind it one more time. All right, so I bind it. I am going to now send the request for logging out. Seems like the request failed. And that is happening because of the way I am asking to authenticate. So if I take a look at the errors here, oh, they're not showing it to me. Yep, there's all of my weird errors. So we're going to run into a couple of errors right now. It's because this is trying to send undefined. If I refresh it now it comes back as clean. If I go into my cookies, I can actually remove all cookies as well. I can refresh the site, log in. My token is now set. But the remainder of my functions, if I try to log out, that's going to fail. Let me go ahead and delete this again, as well as all of my local storage. Refresh it. Let's try to sign up a different user. Let's go with xa@xa.com and xa. All right, so a new user was created, and a new user can also set their token within HTTP cookies. Now, I mentioned that our logout function is failing, and so is our info function is failing. This is happening because of our token required class. Our token required class is using token authentication, But token authentication is looking for a header within the request named token, followed with the, named authorization with a key value of token, followed by the token.key. So we need to change this authentication method. Right? Let's go ahead and do that. Let's change directory here into our backend. Within our backend, I have this user app. I'm gonna change directory into my user app. And I'm going to make a new file named token auth. And from there, I'm going to open this token auth.py. Now, I mentioned it earlier that we're going to utilize the REST framework's token authentication and inherited. So let's ask from REST framework dot authentication. I want to import token authentication. Now, I also want to raise an exception if the authentication fails. And these exceptions are specific to REST framework. And I want authentication failed. Right? Those are the two classes that I need to grab from REST framework. Now let's utilize polymorphism. Let's go back into our views here, or let's go back in here. And let's talk about how we were able to grab our header, right? This authenticate function is what's grabbing our header, doing all these checking, and then returning authenticate credentials. Now there is a function named, or excuse me, that's it. It's authenticate that we need to change. So this is the method that we're going to be implementing, or that we're going to be utilizing polymorphism to change and update. We're going to make our own class. We're going to call this, we call it cookie authentication. This is going to inherit from token authentication. The first thing we want to do is, hey, I want to have a method for getting the auth token. And let's just call this the auth cookie. It's going to take itself and the request. And all this is going to return is the request, not headers, because remember, this is not located in the headers anymore. Instead, we want to grab it from the cookies attribute. And we're going to get the value of token. Finally, we're going to overwrite the authenticate method utilizing polymorphism. I'm going to say, hey, my token or auth token is equal to self dot get authorization cookie. It's going to pass in the request. Now it's simple. If there isn't an auth token, I want to return none. Otherwise, I want to return self.authenticate credentials, where I'm passing in the auth token. This authentication failed. We never used it. I think this would be a good place to use it, but I don't want to try my luck and add it into the code and break it. So let's see a function first, and then we'll come back and try to update this. Well, now I created this class called CookieAuthentication, right? Which is going to work with my cookies. Let's go into views and just change our token required class to where my authentication classes, rather than utilizing token authentication, will utilize cookie authentication. So I'm going to change this to from token auth. I want to import cookie authentication. And I'm going to take off this token authentication and exchange it for cookie. Everything else will work just fine now. Or it should work just fine now, I should say. It's going to be able to delete, authenticate my user, and do all of the necessary steps. And now let me add, commit, and push. Now within SSH, we can pull. All right. Let's change directory into your backend. Utilize GUnicorn once again. Now let's go into our front-end application, clear everything out from cookies, and clear everything out from our local storage. Let's log in the current user. Seems like that failed. So let's see what happened here. No module named token auth. All right. So we have an error here when I tried to import. It's saying no module named token auth. So let's change that to from user app dot token auth import token authentication. And now let's do the whole git add, git commit, git push. Here we're going to git pull origin ready to deploy. And let's try our GUnicorn command one more time. All right. Okay, it worked. I was able to sign in. If I refresh the site, it's able to grab my info. I can still go to list. All right, all of my token authentication should be updated, so I should be able to create something new. All right, I can refresh it. Everything is still populating. And when I log out, my token is now gone. So I've just changed my code to utilize token authentication. Now there's a little bit on the front end side that we also need to change. It's not much, I promise. We're just going to go to utilities. Luckily, we isolated all of our code. Here in our Axios instance, all we're going to do is we're going to add an attribute called with credentials. We're going to set this attribute to true. This is just to expect Axios to have that cookie being sent. Now, when it comes to this user confirmation, well, this user confirmation is no longer going to grab a cookie or check if there is a token. It is always going to send our request. Right, from there, we can do the same thing where we check the response. If it works, then it's just going to return the user. We no longer need this delete method. And we know we want to return null if it doesn't work. Same thing for our user registration. We no longer want to set a token. This is no longer necessary code. And we know that there is no longer a token within the response.data. All right. User login is going to be the same thing. there is no longer a token within response.data. We no longer need to worry about a token. Our user logout works the same. No longer a token being placed within my application. And that is it as far as updating, right? Now, let's go ahead and push our final changes here. Our final changes get pushed. I'm gonna kill the unicorn, get pull, origin, ready to deploy. All right. From there, I'm gonna change directory into my front end, run npm run build because I need to update the static files that will be rendered by Nginx. And then I'm going to copy these static files of my dist directory into my user, share, Nginx, HTML. All right, so now that that has been updated, I can utilize udo service, Nginx restart to update the static files that it is rendering. Go back into my backend, utilize gunicorn here to interact with my WSGI file. Bind my server back to port 000 at port 8000. Everything should be updated and working. Let's take a look here. I refresh my site. Looks like I broke it, unfortunately. Let's take a look here. API users 401 unauthorized. All right. Let me go into my application tab. So that's empty. Let me go ahead and make that empty again. Oh no. Get API/users. Got it. So that's returning an unauthorized request. And that is happening because of my user confirmation here. So let's change this for a try. And catch. All right, well, that is unfortunate because now I have to do this whole push and commit and all right, there you go. Now it's pushed. Control C, get pull, origin, ready to deploy. All right, change directory into my front end, npm run build. -r. Sudo cp-r. So copy recursively my distance file and user share nginx HTML. All right. Let's do sudo service nginx restart. And then finally gunicorn to do project.wsgi /bind 0000 at port 8000. Okay, good. So we still get our 401 unauthorized, which is okay. That's what I expected. Let's go ahead and log in. We were able to log in. If I go over to my cookies, we can see that my cookie was set. Can come to my list and I can log out. And that's it. We have now deployed a full stack application utilizing HTTPS and using authentication through HTTP cookies rather than through our response headers or request headers, which is just going to improve our security overall as far as protecting our users' credentials. All right. At this point, does anyone have any questions over anything we've covered today? Okay, just to do a quick review over the code that we changed, we removed any token-oriented code from all of our API calls and exchanged them with this with credentials is equal to true in the front end. As far as our backend goes, we changed our response to no longer include the token within the response body. Rather, we placed it inside of a function that when this response gets processed by a browser, it's going to pick up this function and say, hey, me as a browser, I need to store this cookie on the browser side and protect it, right? And that's what we return as a response. We change that for both our sign up and our login functions. We then utilize polymorphism and inheritance to create this cookie authentication class, which rather than getting our token from our response.headers.authorization, it is grabbing our token strictly from the cookies because every request that that browser sends now holds the cookies as well. And that's how we're able to interact with them. We then authenticate our user and return those credentials. And then finally, for our logout function, the last change that we made was we utilized this delete cookie function, which the browser will look for a key of token and delete both of the key and value pair. Again, this only works during HTTPS. It's not going to work in your local development. I have not tried this utilizing Docker, so I'm not sure if it will work with Docker, but definitely worth some exploring if you would like. Finally, to close the loop and exit my EC2 instance, I'm going to go ahead and utilize JUnicorn one more time, but run it in daemon mode so that it's running as a background service. Let me send this request to ensure it is working. All right. And then finally, I can cd tilde and use the function of exit. When I use the function of exit, it logs me out. The connection to my EC2 instance closes, and it returns me back to my local machine for my terminal. And that's it, everyone. There's our full stack application. We're done. Does anyone have any questions? All right. I'm sure that questions will populate when it goes into the time that we want to deploy our personal projects. So please just let myself or Adam know. We'll be more than happy to hop into a room and help everybody out with deployment. Let me go ahead and stop the recording.